Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another entry in the Rapid Record Recap. If you don't know what the Rapid Record Recap is, it's a monthly series that I do where I talk about all of the new releases that I heard in any given month that I didn't get a chance to talk about on the channel for one reason or another. Maybe I didn't have time to talk about it, or maybe I didn't discover it until it was too late to make a full-length video on it, so on and so forth. That being said, this one's a little bit special because this is the final Rapid Record recap of 2023. It's December, the last month of any given year, thus making this, by default, in nature, the last Rapid Record recap of 2023. You learn something new every day. So, before I get into an overly aggressive and increasingly violent rant on why Father Christmas by the Kinks is objectively the best Christmas song, let me get into the Rapid Record recap for December of 2023. Well, kind of. I actually have 5 different albums that I wanted to talk about, not from December of this year, but from earlier in the year that I didn't really get a chance to talk about that I really wanted to. They're actually some pretty big releases, and it's not that I missed them, it's just that they never really fit into my schedule, especially with my inconsistent uploading throughout the majority of this year. So bear with me here as I quickly go through 5 records that I personally had something to say about, but just didn't get the chance to from various months throughout this year, not just December. PJ Harvey, I Inside the Old Year Dying. This is a really nice record from PJ. The instrumentals are very pretty and pleasant. There's a very pastoral vibe going on here, and I think that the recurring themes of life and nature in terms of both lyrics and general musicianship is something that honestly works out. It feels like PJ has a huge love for existence in general, and it really shows here on this record. The songwriting is very strong, though arguably not her best, but if there are any lyrical low points here, it's far and away made up for when she sings with the voice of an angel, which honestly she's been doing since like White Chalk in 2007, but still, before White Chalk she was singing with the voice of a devil-angel fusion hybrid monstrosity, to be totally clear, but that was good too, so. I also didn't know I needed to hear the word femboys in a PJ Harvey song. Like on paper, that just sounds kind of cringy, but that's exactly what happens on the track The Nether Edge, and I think that I'm a little more okay with existence after hearing it. Truly one of the most remarkable moments of 2023 for me. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Aesop Rock, Integrated Text Solutions. If you sat me down and forced me with a gun to my head to make a list of the top 50 most consistent rappers of all time, I would probably put Aesop Rock on there. Honestly, he would be one of my first draft picks, if I'm being totally honest. I mean, the guy's been putting out top-notch quality music for decades at this point, and he doesn't really seem to ever be stopping. Ever. I mean, the guy's a beloved figure within underground hip-hop for a reason, and I mean, sure, everybody has their favorites. I personally put Labor Days before virtually everything else in his discography, but with that in mind, whether you're talking about an underground cult classic like Float or a genuinely popular album like The Impossible Kid, the guy's a legend through and through. And hey, Integrated Text Solutions is really no different. I mean, Aesop himself hasn't really changed anything up here in terms of his flow and lyrical style, but he doesn't really need to. His cryptic word salad poetics have always been deeply interesting since the very beginning of his career decades ago, and they continue to be to this very day, while the more tender and honest introspective moments here are somewhat more relevant in regards to The Impossible Kid and, again, more personal albums for him in the past, but at the same time, they also work incredibly well here. In fact, I would actually argue that Integrated Text Solutions at this point may be the very best display of every single artistic corner that Aesop has covered for himself, at least from a lyrical and general aesthetic standpoint. That's because the instrumentals are great too, whether you're looking at the somewhat electro-industrial influence sounds of the single Mindful Solutionism, one of the biggest bangers that underground music in general had put out throughout the entirety of this year, or something a little bit more laid back and personal like By the River. There's a lot to love here in general, and even though I don't think I have a lot to say about this album, that can't be said about almost every single other Aesop Rock album, I can confidently say that Integrated Text Solutions is a legitimately great album where basically everything comes together. I mean, sure, there is a loose concept here, but honestly, I don't really think that can rightfully be considered the focus. The focus is Aesop and the instrumentals, and both of those are absolutely excellent through and through. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. Lil Uzi Vert, Pink Tape. This is one of those records that I didn't review immediately after it came out because it baffled me, and not like in the way of, whoa, I'm baffled by how good this is. I mean baffled in the way of I had no clue what I was listening to and just did not like it, and to be totally honest, it took me literal months to get around to just fully listening to this album from front to back, let alone multiple times. I mean, this record is overly long, it's messy, it's all over the place, it feels wildly unnecessary, and yet, at the same time, I find it very creatively admirable. I mean, if you've watched my channel any over the course of the past year or so, I think it's become pretty obvious that I personally find a lot of value in music that's experimental, even if it is absolutely terrible, because, hey, even if I don't enjoy something, an experiment's an experiment, and I can respect the pure audacity and the bold artistic direction it takes to do something outside of your own comfort zone. That being said, it can still result in terrible music at times, and that's kind of where the Pink Tape comes in, sorta. Ironically, I actually think that some of the more traditional Uzi tracks here, like Just Wanna Rock and Died and Came Back, are some of the highlights of the entirety of Pink Tape, and that the worst moments here come in the form of those aforementioned experimentations, which are heavily based around alternative metal and nu metal, among other forms of heavier music that they haven't really experimented into terribly much. And as a whole, I just think that the fusion of metal and trap is something that doesn't ever really work particularly well in my experience, and it certainly doesn't work well here, and to be totally honest, even most of the regular kind of Uzi cuts here, the sort of stuff that you would expect from them at this point, just doesn't really hit. That being said, Pink Tape does make me excited to see what Uzi is doing at the moment and where they are going to end up going in the future artistically. I mean, this shows that they have, again, a lot of audacity, a lot of artistic boldness behind them. And you know what? Good for them. It doesn't result in an album that I enjoy, but I appreciate the hell out of this. I just am never going to listen to it again. I'm going to give this album What the Hell is that Chop Suey cover? Oh God, oh Jesus, make it stop, please, oh God, stars out of 5. Danny Brown, Quaranta. I mainly didn't touch on this album because by the time I finally got around to listening to it, I felt like there was nothing I could say that hadn't already been said by 5 million other total dorks on the internet, but at the same time, I can say one thing, which is that although this isn't my favorite album of the year or anything, I don't think any record released in 2023 made me happier for the person that made it than Quaranta. I mean, yes, this record does deal with a lot of darker subject matters, but at the same time, it is also an album celebrating Danny being at a better point in his life, and especially when you take into account the genuine feeling and the genuine agony and suffering of records like Triple X or even Atrocity Exhibition, the absolute just self-hate and the self-destructive mindset on those records. It's just great to see him at the point that he's at now. And it certainly helps that he's still as great a rapper and lyricist as ever, especially with some of those more typical out-of-pocket lines that I think Danny is kind of known for in larger circles. I mean, the single Tantor has the line, "Got a Mexican homie named Chinese Mike," and it's like, what are you talking about? What are you saying? I think few musicians in general at this point are quite as massively likable as Danny Brown, and here on this record, it's a lot of healing for him. And you know what, again, this might not be the record that grips me the most in general, it's certainly not even my favorite Danny Brown record, but at the same time, I'm really happy for the guy, and I'm really glad that he's at a point in his life where this record can come into existence and come from a genuine place. So yeah, if some of Danny's older work was representative of the then and there for him, then Quaranta is very much representative of where he is now, and that's seemingly a much better place. So yeah, if you want to just, like, feel very happy for a person, I'd say give this a listen, even if it, again, does deal with a lot of themes that aren't necessarily the happiest in nature. I think that there are a lot of oddly good vibes coming from this record, even if it does represent some of the darker parts of Danny's current existence, because I mean, hey, it's seemingly a lot better than what it was years ago. I won't really comment further than that because I'm not him, but my point still stands. Quaranta is an album that comes across as a guy doing a lot better than he was a little while back. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Swans, The Beggar. There's a lot of discussion surrounding The Beggar, and I mean, you can really say that about any new Swans album whenever they end up dropping, but especially this one has had a lot of discussion around it because there's the potential that it could be the final record from Swans, the beloved band that started out as a new wave act decades ago and managed to outlast basically all of their peers while evolving more than most bands do in the course of 50 years. That being said, I also think that this is a stunning record in its own right, and you know what, if it is the final Swans record, it's a damn good one to go out on. I mean, in a strange way, this album almost feels like a culmination of every era of Swans, or at least every iconic era of the project. I mean, you have a lot of the more gothic folk kind of influences that you would have found on records like White Light from the Mouth of Infinity, but then you also have songs like Los Angeles City of Death with these very post-apocalyptic, almost grinding kind of feels that feel just as related to their classic 80s no-wave work as it does some of their more recent post-reunion output as well. Just an entirely intense record that I'm just sort of blown away by, even if it's not really my favorite, because Swans, despite not being a band that I would truly say is near and dear to my heart, they're still staples within music nerd circles, within music geek discussions, etc., etc., and knowing that this may be the final record from them, it's a weird feeling. That isn't to mention the nearly 45-minute long The Beggar Lover 3, which is just such an insane, surreal soundscape, and I both hate it and love it at the same time. I just don't know how to feel about this record other than it's great. It's just a really great album. Not one of my favorite albums of the year, ironically, and that's, if anything, testament to just how great this year for music really was, despite what many people have said. But, yeah, this is just, I don't know what to say about this. It's Swans, and if this is their last record, then goddamn. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. Okay, now, officially, I'm done talking about albums in the December Rapid Record Recap that didn't come out in December. Okay? The rest, all December 2023 albums, every single last one of them, I promise you. Probably. Peter Gabriel, I.O. I almost kind of feel like an ass for not giving this a full review. I mean, the guy's been working on this for literal decades, and here I am just saying, oh, it's underwhelming in a brief couple of minutes. But, I mean, what else can I do? That's how I feel. I mean, I do greatly admire that Gabriel has been working on this since the mid-90s. I can barely dedicate myself to doing any sort of exercise for more than a week, so the fact that he's been working on this behemoth of a record for nearly 30 years is just mind-blowing to me, and I have nothing but respect for the artistic ambition and sheer force of willpower to get this album out finally, that perfectionism. It's just so stunning from a conceptual standpoint, and I wish that the outcome was something that impressed me more. I mean, whether you're talking about the bright side mix or the dark side mix, I'm just not grabbed by this album in any particular way, and the ballads, especially such as Playing for Time, just bore me to tears, and although both mixes have absolute definitive differentiations between them that certainly separate them as their own individual works in a way, they don't feel different enough to really have me be willing to say that I really prefer one over the other, or that this one's really great, but this one not so much, etc., etc. They just both feel like nothing that really excites me. His vocals are decent, I suppose, but Gabriel's voice has never really been the center of his music, ever since the Genesis days even. He's always been more of a background figure in terms of vocals for the sake of really highlighting a lot of the compositional qualities of his work. Again, whether that's more of the prog stuff he was doing with Gabriel era Genesis, or a lot of the more experimental art rock work that he went on to do as a solo artist afterwards. It's always been a focus on style and aesthetics over actual vocal work, and he sounds good here as an actual vocalist. His voice sounds fine, but that's not really something that adds much to the scenario. Whether you choose the bright side mix or the dark side mix, it's overly long. It doesn't have much to say artistically that I really feel hasn't been said by Gabriel on past better works, and more than anything, I just don't feel like this album was worth waiting over 20 years for. I mean, hell, this album's older than I am. That's kind of weird, and what's weirder is that it's not particularly good. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Conway the Machine and Conductor Williams, Conductor Machine. This is a really strong collaborative EP between Griselda member Conway the Machine and the ever underrated producer Conductor Williams. I've seen this be pretty polarizing within the fan bases of both artists involved, but I don't know, personally I'm really into it. I personally really love the somewhat bizarre style of Williams' production. I mean, it's jazzy, but still minimalist at the same time, and there's a lot of really odd samples, plus the whole "Conductor, we have a problem" producer tag is weirdly likable, despite being one of the most in-your-face tags really out there right now in general. I kind of think it works out really well. And that isn't to mention that Conway himself is really in the pocket here. I mean, his flows are tight, his lyricism is solid, and his personality really shines through on these very off-kilter instrumentals. I actually kind of hope that he continues to participate in more experimental outings in the future, because this shows a lot of potential. Also, love the Genius's appearance on the track Flame. Really stands out as a pretty great feature. I don't really know how to, naturally, fluidly incorporate that into, discussing this EP, but, I mean, it's true. She sounds tight there. It's good. So yeah, this one definitely has a lot of people torn, it seems, but as for myself, I think it's a very good EP, and I highly recommend you give it a listen if it sounds like something that interests you. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Thy Slaughter, Soft Rock. This is technically the final closing artistic remarks of the now legendary PC Music label before it officially resigns itself a little bit and primarily just becomes a label for putting out archival releases without any actual new, fresh drops. And for a final goodbye letter, if you will, from PC Music, man, this is disappointing. For some context, Thy Slaughter was originally a duo formed by Easy Fun and A.G. Cook, two of the most important members of PC music history. They formed in 2014 as a duo, called themselves Thy Slaughter, and they put out a single song called Bronze before seemingly dissolving and going off to do their own things just as quickly as they had formed. Them coming back together to do one final proper project, and at that, a real LP, to, really close off PC Music, that sounds brilliant. It sounds like the best way to end off the giant legacy and huge amount of influence that PC Music has left behind. And it's just not. There's just really nothing to latch onto here. There's no emotional atmosphere, there's no melodies or choruses that feel all that distinct, and worst of all, it just feels like A.G. Cook and Easy Fun's respective artistic personalities don't really show through here, and even inviting longtime PC Music affiliates like Charlie XCX and, of course, the late, great Sophie, it just doesn't do anything. It's obviously trying to be some sort of grand finale to PC Music, and again, this massive legacy that a seemingly unassuming label has left behind, but unfortunately, it just doesn't do anything. It's not that it's a horrible record, it's just that it's a horrible closure to what is otherwise one of the most interesting and innovative music labels of the entire century so far. This just feels fine but underbaked, and the 32-minute runtime doesn't really allow it to do anything in particular that feels as grand in scope as it seemingly wants to be. It's just a really disappointing finale for PC Music. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Panopticon, The Rime of Memory. It's atmospheric, it's massive, it's devastating, it's musically impressive, it's Panopticon. It's the same old, same old. They are one of the most iconic atmospheric black metal projects of all time, and for damn good reason. And I mean, this record doesn't really do anything that's particularly new, but it feels huge. It's deeply emotional, it's cold, it's brutal, it's basically everything that you would want a Panopticon record to be, and really it's hard to fault it for anything. That's really all there is to say. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. YUKIKA, Time-Lapse. This EP isn't really bad at all, but I think it's just way too pristine for its own good, even by the highly pristine standards that K-pop has set for itself, both in the mainstream and the lesser discussed corners of it. It just feels like maybe this is just a bit too lifeless for its own good. I mean, I really want to like this EP. There are things to like about it. I mean, first of all, it's a follow-up to the excellent 2021 EP Time About from YUKIKA, which, personally, I considered one of the best EPs of that given year. And that isn't to mention that YUKIKA herself is a pretty strong vocalist. I won't say she has the most unique personality in the world, but, from a technical standpoint, she is a good performer. But that doesn't really show that much here when the instrumentals are pretty bland city pop based sounds, and she doesn't really do anything to stand out as a performer, not really delivering her own unique style or anything like that. This EP is really underwhelming. It tries to be very lush and punchy and fun, and it just comes across as flat and dull and, not fun. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Full of Hell and Nothing, When No Birds Sang. What do you get when a sludge metal band like Full of Hell clashes with a more shoegaze-oriented band like Nothing? A pretty good album, apparently. I'm not gonna lie, this one worked out way better than I expected it to. This collab feels like it should work way less than it actually does, but ultimately, in the end, we see both sides of the collaboration shining beautifully. I mean, for Nothing, there are a lot of these really beautiful atmospheric, ambient, and shoegaze passages, and as for Full of Hell, there's a huge amount of dense drone metal adjacent riff work here that I think really sees both sides of the spectrum just doing beautiful work in their own respective ways, while also blending together very well to ensure that this project doesn't really feel like it's leaning too much in one way or the other. I mean, if you really had to make the argument of who this album really belonged to or anything like that, you could certainly say that there are some more shoegaze leanings here, thus making it more of a Nothing album that just so happens to feature Full of Hell. That being said, I do think that there is a pretty perfect balance struck here between the two, and both of them are delivering exactly what they've delivered in their own past own releases, which is good quality sludge metal, or in this case, post-metal, I guess. There are too many genres. Why can't we make less genres? Why? In all seriousness, though, yeah, this is really good atmospheric sludge metal, shoegaze, post-metal fusion, and because of that, I think that maybe both should consider doing more collaborations in the future. I mean, hey, it works for bands like Boris, so why not Full of Hell and Nothing? There's a really thick atmosphere here, and there's a lot of weight to the overall vibe, which is why I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. John Zorn, Parrhesiastes. Avant-garde composer of a million genres, John Zorn back with another record, and it's honestly pretty traditional by his standards, which is kind of weird to see, especially for myself as someone who's primarily familiarized with his work through his more experimental and even avant-garde metal-leaning projects. That being said, the jazz fusion kind of tones taken up on this record are honestly really, really nice. Zorn arranges some great compositions, Kenny Grahowski's drumming really shines here, and I think that, again, some of those aforementioned avant-garde metal influences do ever so slightly show up here in a couple of passages that was unexpected, for myself at least, with tracks like the eventual devalorization of the Perhaps having these heavy guitar build-ups that eventually have their own kind of respective climaxes, resulting in something that feels uniquely John Zorn, but definitely different from the other projects that I've heard from him. I can't really comment too much on his entire discography, because I haven't heard it, because I'm, what's the word I'm looking for? Normal. But that being said, This might not be a huge shocker of a record to people who have listened to every single record he's ever put out, which, if you have, please go to therapy, take your meds, get some help. But otherwise, for people like myself, I personally think that this is a really strong jazz fusion record that has a lot of intriguing influences to boot. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Health, Rat Wars. In a few ways, this record almost feels like a really nice tribute to classic electro-industrial sounds, with the way it kind of interprets a lot of sort of classic drum tones that you would have maybe heard from bands like Frontline Assembly, or even to an extent KMFDM, and some of those punkier influence sides of the electro-industrial spectrum, while at the same time having a lot of these heavily static, very washed out synth tones that give the entire record its own unique modern flair, very much rooting it in the presence of electronic and industrial music. That being said, there are some changes I personally would have made here. I think that the best moments here come from more of the industrial metal-oriented cuts like Sicko, as I feel like Health really get to release the full extent of their creative aggression via those tracks, and some of the more laid-back cuts like Future of Hell just don't necessarily impress me. I feel like they're trying to go for more of an atmospheric thing there, more of a somewhat melodic and chill kind of thing, and it just doesn't really capture me in any particular way. That's not to say those tracks are bad. They're still alright, they're composed well, they're performed very well. I just kind of feel like Health at their angriest is when they happen to also be at their best. I think the moments where Health choose to restrain themselves are also the same moments where they start to come across as a bit monotonous and maybe a bit unengaging, but as a whole, I do think that this is a solid record, and, as always, I'm excited to see what left field out-of-pocket sounds Health choose to vibe with on their next record, whether it's more classic electro-industrial like this, or whatever form of harsh electronic influence noise they choose to make next. I'm pretty much down for whatever from them at this point. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Nicki Minaj, Pink Friday 2. Nicki as an artist has never really been known for putting out the best albums in terms of consistency, in terms of not being an absolute mess, etc., etc., but, Pink Friday 2 really just takes that a step further. Actually, it's pretty impressive how much went wrong here. I don't know why relying on extremely obvious samples for the sake of nostalgia appeal is the big sickness making its way through mainstream rap right now, but that disease has infected Nicki Minaj here on Pink Friday 2, her first album in 5 years, as well as the sequel to her beloved 2010 record, Pink Friday, her major breakthrough album. You would think that there would be a lot more seriousness in the approach to such a major record here, but nope, it just kind of feels like bait most of the time, and that just is sad. I mean, whether you're talking about the Girls Just Wanna Have Fun sample on Pink Friday Girls, which is just so nothing, or the usage of Super Freak on Super Freaky Girl, which is just baffling, because wow, nobody's ever sampled Super Freak by Rick James before, ever, except like Jay-Z and Gucci Mane and Jeezy and fucking MC Hammer. It's just so overdone, every single sample on this record. Maybe it's because I've just been repeatedly hit in the face with every single, Coi Leray kind of figure, or even somewhat recently, to a very small extent, Troye Sivan. Just like every other person on this planet, I'm just really, really exhausted of all of these overly obvious samples that are done exclusively to be like, you remember this song that came out in the 80s? Well, I turned it into something slightly different, and, I made it a little edgier. It just is so annoying to a ridiculous extent. Beyond that, this is still just a genuinely awful album in the majority of the other aspects here. I mean, Nicki's performance isn't the worst, but she feels really phoned in throughout the majority of this record, and I can also confidently say that almost every single instrumental on here feels really lifeless, especially the more trap-oriented cuts like Beep Beep as well as Big Difference. They just feel like they had very little to outright no thought put into them at all to make them even slightly unique for one of the biggest rappers on the planet. The more straightforward pop flavors of songs like Cowgirl and Last Time I Saw You Go, they kind of go for more of a, I guess, alt pop kind of thing. It's bad. It's bad. I won't say they feel disingenuous. This album never quite sounds like it's something that Nicki Minaj did not want to make. This sounds like an album that she wanted to make. It's just that in a world where there's such an oversaturated market for this kind of personality devoid, wildly uninspired style of pop and pop rap, this just does not feel even remotely essential within popular culture right now. And obviously, Nicki Minaj isn't at her most relevant at this point. Not to say she's fallen into obscurity, but my point is I'm not expecting her to make some sort of giant cultural tsunami with her latest effort or anything like that, but man, this album just feels so unimportant. I've actually kind of come to the conclusion that I think albums from people like Drake this year were more relevant to people than the new Nicki Minaj album, and that's kind of baffling and somewhat disturbing, even. This is just a really terrible, terrible record with awful pacing that hops on that sample mania bandwagon that's making its way through the mainstream right now while delivering nothing of worth from Nicki herself. This isn't the worst album of the year, but I think it is one of the most outright annoying and obnoxiously unenjoyable albums of the year. I can't even find this fun ironically or anything like that. It's just a terrible, terrible album. I'm going to give this record 1.5 stars out of 5. Tate McRae, Think Later. Who is this woman and why does she have more Spotify listeners than Future? I've been aware of Tate McRae for a while now, actually, and I was almost personally insulted by the mindlessness of her 2022 record, I Used to Think I Could Fly. Just one of the most unimportant, uninspired, just completely devoid of anything albums I've ever heard. Just a genuinely rancid record that I would not recommend to my worst enemy, and I went into this record expecting the same thing, and I kind of got it, but I mean, not really. Whereas I was insulted with how obnoxiously terrible I Used to Think I Could Fly was, I'm just insulted by how boring Think Later is. I mean, this is just a drag of a listen. I mean, Tate McRae is really an anomaly at the moment. I mean, sure, there are tons of bland pop stars out there, but even artists who aren't really the most popular within more critical circles have at least some sort of appeal that makes sense. You know what I mean? That whole Ed Sheeran balladeer thing, or Taylor Swift having the origin story of the whole girl next door kind of thing before she became the monolithic figure that she is today. And even more recent pop stars like Olivia Rodrigo and Billie Eilish have brought entirely unique personas, aesthetics, and personalities to mainstream music to make me confidently say that they deserve to be in the place that they are. I'm not saying I love everything that every single one of those artists puts out. In fact, a couple of them I don't even really like that much, but still, they have a reason to be there, and they have an appeal, even if that appeal doesn't really apply to myself or a lot of people with similar taste to myself. Tate McRae just doesn't have any appeal, and I don't get it. I mean, her songs are written mediocrely at best. Her vocals are not at all impressive, even if not terrible. She has no distinct personality. She's a total bore to listen to, and it doesn't help that every single instrumental that she performs over just feels like the most cookie-cutter dance pop music out there. It's just really terrible. And the moments on this record, Think Later, where she tries to get a little more serious, going more in the personal alt-pop kind of direction, it just doesn't feel like there's any connection with her as an artist whatsoever. She almost doesn't feel like a human being. She's a wax figure in musician form. This isn't as bad as her debut by default, seeing as I personally consider I Used to Think I Could Fly an outright atrocity against my ears. That being said, this is still a bad record all the same, and I am just so confused about how she got to the point that she's at. I mean, good for her, I guess, but how and why? I'm going to give this record 2 stars out of 5. Conway the Machine and 1-2, Palermo. Griselda member Conway the Machine, back again with another fairly short record and another collaborative record with German producer 1-2, and this results in a project that is somehow even more off-kilter than his work with Conductor Williams earlier in the month, albeit with results that I would personally say are nowhere near as successful, even if they are pretty decent. 1-2's actual instrumentals are really solid. I dig the sort of seedy lo-fi vibe that's being provided by a lot of the beats here, but it's the Conway part that kind of comes in and messes everything up. His flow here is fine, don't get me wrong. He just doesn't fit on these kinds of instrumentals. I mean, the appeal of the work that he did earlier in the month with Conductor Williams is that everything was barely holding itself together, and here on Palermo, it's not. It's just not holding itself together. All of that being said, Conway's flow is still strong, even if, again, he doesn't always fit over the instrumentals, and his lyrics are pretty decent, I guess, kind of, but the main appeal here is the fact that both artists involved's own unique personalities really shine through. Conway with his sort of punchy, casual aggression, and 1-2 with, again, that sort of seedy underground kind of vibe with a lot of those semi-lo-fi tones. So overall, I think that this is a decent collaboration still. It's just one where the two artists involved kind of clash more than I would say was intended. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of the December 2023 Rapid Record Recap, as well as the entirety of Rapid Record Recaps for the year of 2023, because December is the last month of a year, which means that next month will be another year. And that year, you're not going to believe this, it's going to be 2024, okay? We're going to get pretty crazy here. I might even upload. Who knows? It's unpredictable what I'm going to do, but the main point that I want to make is thank you for watching the Rapid Record Recaps of 2023. Even if this is the only one that you watched, or this is the first video of mine that you're seeing, I really do greatly appreciate it. It means a lot to me. And with that being said, I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.